my favorite topic, falling in love with compassion. I would say falling in love with bodhicitta, but you might not know what that is yet. Speak up. Okay, so I can be heard. Just a comment on the refuge prayer we just said. It starts off with in order to obtain perfect enlightenment, as opposed to enlightenment that's not yet perfect. And we were talking about Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. So for those who are on their way to Buddhahood, there are levels of enlightenment before Buddhahood. So we consider Buddhahood to be perfect enlightenment. And then the different Bodhisattva stages of training are different levels of enlightenment. So Bodhisattvas are enlightened, but they're not perfectly enlightened. And that is reflected, not only will we touch on it a little bit later on, but that is reflected in the fact that when we say, in order to obtain perfect enlightenment, and that's like, I am not just going to stop with enlightenment. I'm not going to say, hey, I'm arrived, I'm enlightened, folks. Aren't I cool? Is we are vowing to go the distance. And one of the things our teacher likes to say is, wherever you're at, there's more. One of the dangers that can happen on the path is when people have a significant realization, they think they have it made, and they create a glass ceiling, and they don't think there's more, and they're not open to being taught. And sadly, there's a number of I would say, sincere spiritual practitioners and teachers in the world at any given time who are at that place. They've had some kind of a significant realization. They think they got it made. They are enlightened. Whatever it is they've realized, which is an important realization, is like the ultimate, and they stop. And so then they never reach the ultimate, or at least not until someone can come along sometime and convince them that there's more. So just to solve that problem before we hit it, our teacher is continually telling us there is more, there is more, there is more. And so this vow we just made indicates that I'm not going to stop. I know there's more, and I'm going to keep going. So I just wanted to point that out because we're actually going to come back to that. So falling in love with compassion. My question to you is, what is the difference between love and being in love? And this is the common vernacular. I just love chocolate. Oh, I'm in love. I'm teasing. But anyway, but seriously, when people say they love something versus I'm in love, what's the difference? Yes?
I thought you were moving toward the difference between eros and agape, which is the difference between an open-hearted, generalized love and a sort of physically oriented love toward an individual. But you said love bananas, and that just is a misunderstanding.
No, actually I said love chocolate.
Love chocolate.
But no, this is the common vernacular.
Right.
We'll say I love chocolate, or, so we say it in our culture. Oh, we might say, I just love that little girl. She's such a cutie. Or I just love my pet. Or I just love my friend. We generally don't say I'm in love with my friend. What's the difference between love and being in love? From your experience. When you've loved something or someone, and then you've been in love, from your experience. This is not the definition, this is the experience of loving or being versus being in love.
For me, being in love has been a temporary insanity.
You're saying it doesn't necessarily last. Okay, go ahead and what's the insanity bit?
Not really seeing things as they are.
Okay, what is it that causes you to not see things as they are? What are you experiencing that causes you to not see things?
Projecting perceptions onto others.
Okay, projecting perceptions onto others. That might be part of it. What else?
Being completely self-referent about it. It's about me.
It might be. It might be. It might not. I mean, there are people who fall in love and actually get married and they're in love the rest of their lives. It's rare, but it happens. And I can look at my parents. So, I mean, I know it happens.
It's a dissolution of the distinction between yourself and some other individual.
Okay, it can be a dissolution. That's what you can experience that.
It's a different level of intensity, for one thing. And
So being in love is more intense. It's more emotionally charged. Would you say that?
potentially, yes.
Okay. I am not in love with chocolate.
Right.
Right. Okay.
Unless you just really are, and then that's okay.
I'm not.
But
But okay, yeah.
But that might look like addiction. It's
Maybe.
take it or leave it.
I think when you love someone, it is a constant, never changing emotion. When you're in love with someone, it goes up and down and up and down, and it's not as stable as.
Why is it not stable when you're in love with someone?
because they're not perfect.
Because they're not perfect. If they were perfect, do you think being in love with them would change? Or would it be stable? That's an excellent question. Think about that. If they were perfect, if they could not disappoint you.
Oh, I wouldn't say that.
If it would, now, you may have to think there is no human being. Theoretically, think about it. If they could not disappoint you, if it was impossible, if they were so perfect they could not disappoint you, would you ever fall out of love with them?
Yes, because of our own imperfections, because we're so married to our suffering and our discontent.
Okay, so we're saying that then we're turning back and saying we haven't gotten there yet. Okay, I'll take that. What else is it like to be in love? You guys are trying to downplay all the good parts of being in love. Now, if I were to ask this to say Uzur and Rinta, I would have a totally different, come on, people.
Stop being so cynical.
Yeah, that's right. Stop being so cynical. Tell me more about being in love. What's it like to be in love? How do you experience it?
It's joyful.
It's joyful. You're filled with joy and delight. It's very intense. What else?
It's like something that just hits you. You know?
Out of
It's
nowhere,
almost-
something
yeah,
like that.
like you don't even see it coming, and all of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh.
Okay. All right. It just touches something and you're like, whoa, it wakes up.
It
Something
awakens
wakes up.
something better inside as well.
Pardon?
It awakens something better. It awakens like a desire to be a better person, so that you can more fully relate to this person who's like your object of love.
Okay. So it actually motivates you to action then. You want to better relate to them, so being in love motivates you to do something toward the object of your being in love, toward the object of that love. And might I say it also draws and keeps your attention. You're enthralled. You think about the object of your love day and night. Okay, would you say that's true? So being in love, it's emotionally charged. It's filled with joy and delight. It draws and keeps your attention. And you're motivated to action. What is the danger of being in love? You guys kind of started there.
It takes up all your time.
It takes up all your time.
Losing your identity.
You're losing your identity. That may or may not be a good thing. Depends on your identity, I guess.
So it sort of reminds me of finding the Dharma and finding Buddha. Do you have the same reactions? Surprise!
A surprise! How about that? You're saying you can be in love with the Dharma.
Yeah. Has all the same characteristics.
Wow. Fancy that. Thank you, Migma. One of the dangers of being in love is disappointment. People can disappoint. People do disappoint. People will disappoint. Since none of us people are perfect, it's inevitable. There's no way we can avoid disappointing others or being disappointed by others. It's just the way it is in the human realm.
And there's this whole other thing of, I love this person, I want more love, I will spend more time with them, they are mine. The possessiveness and and the always wanting more.
Okay, never being satisfied. Now my question is then, can the Dharma disappoint? Since you said it's like finding the Dharma, can the Dharma disappoint? Pam is shaking her head no.
No, the Dharma can't disappoint from its side, but you can become disappointed in the Dharma.
Okay.
Meaning that I think if you can put into practice the actual Dharma, it will never disappoint you. But we have lots of conceptions and ideas about the Dharma that are not necessarily consistent with its
the Dharma
meaning,
mm-hmm.
and then we become disappointed.
Then we can become disappointed. Now, yes.
I was looking at it differently, just thinking about, we always receive the Dharma through people. So to the extent that our relationships or our ability to not be disappointed by people is not perfect, whether it's through a book or through peers or through a teacher. I mean, we're very familiar in the West actually with having gurus that at some point, disappointed us. There was a lot of scandals in the 80s and 90s,
Mm-hmm.
particularly. So I think we're actually very familiar with being disappointed by the people who bring us the Dharma.
Right. So if we can separate the people who bring us the Dharma from the Dharma itself, and that's kind of tough to do, to separate the people who bring us the Dharma from the Dharma itself. But if we could, just hypothesize that you can, and what would that feel like? Now I want to actually go to the topic, can bodhicitta disappoint? Whereas the question is, what is bodhicitta, right? What is bodhicitta? So, nobody knows bodhicitta better than Shantideva.
The aspiring bodhicitta or the bodhicitta?
Bodhicitta.
No.
Okay. So now you know there's different kinds. So that no one knows bodhicitta better than Shantideva. And no one can describe bodhicitta better than Shantideva. So I'm going to rely heavily on Shantideva to describe bodhicitta. And he begins, always, homage to the enlightened Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. I prostrate to the enlightened Buddhas endowed with the truth body, and to the Bodhisattvas and all other objects of prostration. Shows the depth of his feeling for them. I will explain briefly, in accordance with the scriptures, how to engage in the condensed practices of the Bodhisattvas. There is nothing written here that has not been explained before, and I have no special skill in composition. Editorial note, I beg to disagree. Back to his words. My reason for writing this is to benefit others and to keep my mind acquainted. Thus, the strength of my faith and my virtuous realizations might for a while be increased by this, and perhaps others who are as fortunate as I might also find this meaningful to behold. This precious human life, so hard to find, offers the ultimate goal for living beings. How about that? Did you ever think that you could get the ultimate goal from being a human? If we do not strive to accomplish this goal now, how will such a precious opportunity arise again? Just as on a dark and cloudy night, a flash of lightning for a moment illuminates all, so for the worldly, through the power of Buddha's blessings, of virtuous intention occasionally and briefly occurs. Thus, while our virtues are mostly weak, our non-virtues are extremely strong and fearsome. Now, at this point, we might say, wait a minute. I'm not out there causing a lot of problems. My virtues aren't strong. My non-virtues aren't fearsome, and my virtues aren't weak. I'm honest, and I don't steal, and I don't lie much, only to get what I want, and then I just sort of bend the truth a little bit for a good cause. Okay. Now I have to ask, and you don't have to answer. Since midnight, how many negative thoughts have you had about another person? And you've been asleep for most of those hours. The day hath hardly begun. Okay. I'll repeat what he said. Thus, while our virtues are mostly weak, our non-virtues are extremely strong and fearsome and tend to intrude themselves on our mind very, very frequently during the day. Okay, that's my rereading. Other than bodhicitta, a compassionate mind wishing for enlightenment, what virtue can overcome the heaviest of evils? Do you realize what he just said there? Bodhicitta is the virtue that can overcome the heaviest of evils. And first he says, our minds are full of heavy evils. Maybe not really, really black evils, but habitual. We habitually think negative things. We habitually think negative things. It's a habit. And our minds return to it again and again and again. And if they did not, we would be Buddhas already. So he says, other than bodhicitta, what can overcome that? The able ones, the Buddhas who have considered this for many eons, have all seen bodhicitta to be the most beneficial. Why? Because through it, countless masses of living beings can easily attain the supreme bliss of enlightenment. Countless masses of living beings can easily attain the supreme bliss of enlightenment. Bodhicitta is the easiest way to overcome evils and achieve enlightenment. Rinpoche has said there's 800 different entries into the enlightened state. In fact, a couple weeks ago, she said equanimity is one of them. She said in the past that there's 3 overall categories. The entries fit into one of 3 categories. There's the category of the direct perception of emptiness, or understanding that the world is illusory, not just intellectually, but really understanding that it's illusory. You just don't even have to understand how it's illusory, only that it's illusory, and you understand it to your bones. In other words, it's energetic, it's deep. It's not all intellectual. That's one. So there are some meditations and practices where people are, and it's very common in Buddhism, trying to directly perceive the illusory nature of the world in order to gain enlightenment. And that approach is considered a wisdom approach, and understanding the illusory nature of the world is basically considered wisdom, and there's increasing levels of wisdom. The other one is the arisal of bodhicitta, which are the compassion practices. Bodhicitta is an extremely exquisite variety of compassion, focused on relieving the sufferings of others without exception, all others, including, let's say, our governor. Or think of somebody that you're not particularly fond of, that you don't think necessarily is deserving of happiness. If you have bodhicitta, you don't leave them out of your desire to relieve them of suffering. And then the third way is an energetic transformation. And sometimes Rinpoche calls it the path of power. If you've noticed in a lot of spiritual traditions, the coin of the realm, or what other people view. The ones that you view as being enlightened or highly skilled are those who can show off psychic abilities. And the ability that the more psychic ability you have, then the more respect you get. And Rinpoche calls that the path of power. The problem is it can be seductive. It can be seductive and take you away from bodhicitta. So there's all these different ways, and they fit under these 3 broad umbrellas. The story of Atisha, he had already achieved enlightenment through at least 1 or 2 other paths in his life. And his primary Buddha that guided him was Green Tara, had been his entire life. He was known for having this relationship with Green Tara. And he was at Bodh Gaya. The temple at Bodh Gaya is built where the Buddha achieved enlightenment. And he was doing kora or circumambulation around the temple. And as he was circumambulating, Green Tara appeared to him. And she told him that she wanted him to go to Indonesia, I believe to Sumatra, to study with a master that in Tibetan Buddhism we refer to as Serlingpa. That wasn't his actual name in his own language. We call him Serlingpa. Because Serlingpa was a master of bodhicitta practices. And she told him that bodhicitta was the supreme method for achieving enlightenment. So even though he already had achieved enlightenment in other ways, she sent him to Sumatra to study with Serlingpa for 12 years in order to master bodhicitta with, apparently Serlingpa was probably the world's master of bodhicitta at that time, otherwise Green Tara would have sent him somewhere else. So I'm making that assumption. So why would Green Tara think it's important enough to send somebody who's already a master to learn bodhicitta? Because it's the supreme method for achieving enlightenment. Now, this was after the time of Shantideva, but it's a similar message. It says, because through it countless masses of living beings can easily attain enlightenment. So not only is it the supreme method, it's the easiest one. So that's pretty cool. Those who wish to destroy their own suffering, those who wish to dispel the suffering of others, and those who wish to experience much happiness. Is that any of us? Do we wish to dispel our own suffering? Do we wish to dispel the suffering of others? Do we wish more great happiness? How do you think he's going to say we can do that? I'll give you 3 guesses. How do you think Shantideva says we can accomplish those goals? Should never forsake the practice of bodhicitta. The moment bodhicitta is generated, even in pitiful beings bound within the prison of samsara, they become bodhisattvas, a son or daughter of Buddha, and are worthy of veneration by humans and gods. Bodhicitta is what creates a bodhisattva. The moment it's generated. And that means that they've achieved a level of enlightenment. The first time it happens, I would imagine it's the first level of enlightenment, because perhaps if you've achieved a higher level in a previous life and you arise bodhicitta again, then I don't know how quickly you return to the previous level. I'm not wise enough to know that, but I will hold the possibility that occurs. Just like the supreme elixir that transmutes into gold. Wouldn't it be nice sometimes to have something that you could just put on, let's say, the meditation cushion and turn it into gold? I think if we could turn that meditation cushion into gold right now, Joyful Path could find a use for that. Okay, aside from meditation. Just like the supreme elixir that transmutes into gold, bodhicitta can transform this impure body we have taken into the priceless jewel of a Buddha's form. Therefore, firmly maintain bodhicitta. Since the limitless wisdom of Buddha, the sole navigator of living beings, upon thorough investigation, has seen its preciousness, those who wish to be free from samsara suffering should firmly maintain this precious mind of bodhicitta. Whereas all other virtues are like plantain trees in that they are exhausted once they bear fruit. Now, a lot of trees bear fruit once and then they're exhausted. They don't bear fruit again until the next season. The enduring celestial tree of bodhicitta is not exhausted, but increases by bearing fruit. The more you generate, the more you have. You can't become exhausted with bodhicitta. It feeds itself. Does that make sense? Just as when those who are greatly afraid rely upon a courageous one, whoever relies upon bodhicitta will immediately be freed from danger, even if they have committed unbearable evils. How could bodhicitta free you from danger if you have committed unbearable evils in the past?
Transforms your motivations.
It transforms you. Immediately, it transforms you. Transforms your motivations, it transforms your mind, it transforms you. Essentially, it's almost like the person who committed those things doesn't exist anymore. Does that make sense? Yes?
Well, I was thinking about it in terms of causes and conditions. So you no longer are in a condition in which you can experience the results of the accumulation of negative karma.
That's true.
And I think it's...
But I think it also destroys the causes.
Well, yeah, but then I was thinking, and it purifies.
It purifies. It destroys the causes. It like uproots the seeds of the non-virtues. So why do the conscientious not rely upon bodhicitta? Just like the fire at the end of the eon, in an instant, it completely consumes all great evils. In an instant, it completely consumes all great evils. You are, in fact, you said transformed. Its countless benefits were explained by the wise protector Maitreya to the Bodhisattva Sudana. In brief, you should know that bodhicitta has two types, the mind that observes enlightenment and aspires, and the mind that observes enlightenment and engages. So aspiring bodhicitta is the one that looks at bodhicitta, realizes its preciousness, and aspires to develop it. Engaging bodhicitta is the one that has arisen authentic bodhicitta and is engaging in the practices of the bodhisattva. They're now putting it into practice through gaining skillful means and practicing the six perfections. Just as the distinction between wishing to go is actually going is understood, so respectively the wise should understand the difference between these two, from the mind that aspires to enlightenment, from the mind that just aspires. You see bodhicitta and you want to develop it. Great effects will arise while in samsara. But from the engaging mind, the mind that engages, an uninterrupted flow of good fortune ensues. Uninterrupted flow. For whoever takes up the engaging mind of bodhicitta with the intention to never turn back from completely liberating the infinite living beings throughout all realms, from that time forth, for that one, there will arise, even if he or she is asleep or apparently unconcerned, vast and powerful merit equal to space that flows without interruption. Why do you think someone who has engaging bodhicitta, vast and powerful merit, from moment to moment, arises and flows without interruption? What did they do to deserve a continual flow of vast and powerful merit? Now think of this. Pretend you have bodhicitta, that you have accomplished that goal.
You're in love.
With
everyone. Without exception.
Without exception. So part of the fact that you have vast and powerful merit is the love that you have for living beings and your determination to relieve their suffering is multiplied by the number of living beings that you have motivation to relieve their suffering. And how many is that?
Infinite.
Infinite. Okay, so the multiplier, and you're determined, so you're working on gaining the skillful means. That's one reason why it's vast and infinite merit flows. And why would a bodhisattva need the infinite merit?
To further transform.
To further transform, and what else? Yes, what else?
All beings.
What?
To help all beings.
To help all beings. The bodhisattva's essential merit is an extremely purified form of good karma. We live in the illusory realms, and karma is how the illusory realms work. So the bodhisattva needs the merit in order to be able to do the work to benefit living beings. So it's way convenient that they're receiving this infinite flow continuously, and they need it in order to benefit living beings. It's sort of like somebody's giving you all the money you need to accomplish all the good things you ever wanted to do. You don't have to worry about it. It just sort of comes in the door. It comes and it goes, and it comes and it goes, and there's no end to the flow. Isn't that totally handy? All right. Is anybody interested in getting this bodhicitta thing?
But wait, there's more.
There's more. Okay, so I kind of refer to chapter 1. He calls explaining the benefits to bodhicitta. But I think what Shantideva is doing is he's trying to get us to fall in love with bodhicitta. Why is he trying to get us to fall in love with bodhicitta? Well, it's emotionally charged. It's filled with joy and delight. It can enthrall us, draw us, and keep our attention, and motivate us to action. So I think of being in love with bodhicitta as aspiring bodhicitta, but not just aspiring bodhicitta when you hear about it in a teaching. And not just saying, yes, I have bodhicitta when you're thinking of ordinary compassion, or because that's sort of the code word among Mahayana Buddhists to gain status, right? I hate to say it, but yes, it is the code word. Mahayana Buddhists recognize the word. And if one can claim bodhicitta, that's the coin of the realm. In Mahayana Buddhism, that's the coin of the realm, right? So one can want to say they have bodhicitta, in fact, for less than pure motivation. And then it's not authentic bodhicitta. But so why would Shantideva then tell us things that will hopefully entice us away from poor motivations and pretending to pure motivations and authentically wanting it? Yes.
I'm back a step, because I think you don't have to have absolutely pure intentions toward bodhicitta to be drawn into the love of bodhicitta. He's just trying to encourage us. I think he's trying to encourage us to go farther. But are you saying that you don't? I guess I want to clarify. Are you saying that you?
Bodhicitta and self-cherishing cannot exist in the same mind at the same time. They're mutually exclusive. So if our motivations are not pure for bodhicitta, in fact, it doesn't exist in our mind at that time.
Even if you're aspiring?
I don't even think you're aspiring. You've stopped aspiring to bodhicitta and you've started aspiring to status. And then bodhicitta is words on the lips. And so my recommendation would be to read this chapter again. And we are not even through it. Why? Because he does such, just hang on a second and I will get to you. Because he does such a wonderful job of making us fall in love with it again. So I'm not saying that we can't fall away from it. I'm saying if we fall away from falling in love with bodhicitta, and I'm not even talking about the bodhicitta, I'm talking about the aspiring bodhicitta. If we fall away from the authentic, pure, true aspiration, being in love with bodhicitta, we need to be honest with ourselves. Rather than trying to say, oh, it doesn't matter. It does. Because every moment we're not in love with it, we're not going toward it. And we're losing that precious human life Shantideva was talking about. I swear, I carry this book with me almost everywhere I go. I carry it in the same bag I have the iPad in. It goes with me everywhere. This is my favorite chapter of all of the Dharma. Mikma's back there nodding her head. How many times have I read it to you? Because it re-inspires me every time I read it.
Shantideva's little Buddha factory right there.
Yes. And I'm trying to sell it. I'm trying to sell you on this book and this chapter, and sell you on the aspiration to fall in love with bodhicitta, because it will enthrall you, it will engage you, it will motivate you. It is joyful and delightful, and it will be in your thoughts all the time. And if you do that, you will achieve authentic bodhicitta much, much quicker. Bodhicitta cannot disappoint. People can disappoint. Beings can disappoint. Bodhicitta cannot disappoint. It is a safe object to be in love with.
I was looking for a little clarification, partly based on your question. Chitta in Sanskrit means thought. And so I'm assuming that this could be translated as right understanding. Bodhicitta.
It depends. You could look at right understanding also as wisdom.
Right.
But bodhicitta, he defines it as, I defined it as a special type of compassion. It's more than ordinary compassion. And he defined, let me see, where is a compassionate mind wishing for enlightenment?
You have said in the course of this talk that it is the easiest path toward
enlightenment. Yes.
Understanding, and have suggested that it is arrived at instantaneously. But you have used the word have. This is something we have. We have this bodhicitta. We get it. But is it something that we do? Is it something that we are? Or is it an attitude?
I think in terms of something that we are, it depends on if we arise the mind and sustain it long enough, we transform so that we are no different than. That it's like a quality that you have mastered so much, you don't even think about it anymore. It's just your nature. And if something is your nature, then we say, I am. Someone who bodhicitta was their nature, they could say in the common vernacular, I am bodhicitta. That doesn't mean that, like, I don't know, my molecules or atoms or how, like define yourself. What does I am mean? In terms of have, it would be a quality that you possess. You've mastered to a different, certain degree, and there's different levels of mastery. But bodhicitta specifically is referred to not just the mind of enlightenment, but even bodhicitta means mind of enlightenment, or as you said, thought. It refers to the compassionate mind of enlightenment. There are minds of enlightenment that are not the compassionate mind of enlightenment. Yes.
Sorry.
Did I answer?
It wasn't totally formed.
Did I answer your question, or did I muddy the water?
Is there a difference? I would suggest that your question, if the path to bodhicitta is through correct behavior, I mean, if it's something you do, and if you do it properly long enough, then it becomes something that you are, which is what you suggested, then one can have questionable motives initially, and as long as one is acting, is doing it properly, then ultimately, presumably, all of the impurities fall away and one comes to be that thing.
Well, that depends on how you define behavior. If you are defining behavior as how you use your mind, how you are acting in your mind, then I would be more likely to agree with you. If you define it as what you do with your body or your speech, then I would not. I could be generous for totally selfish reasons. Okay. I could do acts of compassion that are not based on compassionate motivation. And then, are they really compassion? So if you're talking about behavior, if you're talking about mental behavior, or the thoughts that you arise and sustain and hold, and if a thought that's not congruent with bodhicitta arises, bringing yourself back, and bringing yourself back, and bringing yourself back, then yes, that kind of behavior, you continue doing it, and it will eventually become bodhicitta. And the moment it arises, it is a sudden happening. But the idea that it could suddenly happen without practice is pretty, it's not likely. If it suddenly happened in this life, you could almost assume you practiced it in a previous one, so that the ingredients are already there that would predispose you to be able to do this. Rinpoche has even said compassion is the one thing you cannot be bestowed. You can be bestowed a lot of other understandings, but you cannot be bestowed compassion. It's something you have to do yourself. Yes?
I can just clarify where my question was coming from, too. Because you might say, one might have heard, or I might have understood you to say, if you don't have pure aspiration, or if you're not completely purely aspiring bodhicitta, then it's just useless, it's self-cherishing. But it's not, upon my curiosity and question and further clarification, I understand, and please clarify, that you can have less than pure aspiration for bodhicitta, and it can still draw you in and make you interested and intrigued and want to go there. It's not going to totally get you there. And Shantideva is saying, that's not going to totally get you there. And here's why you should really love bodhicitta.
Yes.
And as you begin, as that less than great motivation sparks your curiosity, Shantideva or others are standing there to say, and here's what you really want to know.
Yeah.
Here's what you really want to know. And you begin to fall more authentically and more deeply in love with bodhicitta as it goes. So I was just curious, because at first I was hearing, why bother if you don't have pure motivation? But then in your answer I heard, this is why. Right.
You decide to improve your motivation. The Buddhas and Bodhisattvas entice us by showing us how sweet it is. Colin.
I think part of this discussion that's always been confusing for me is how the words are used, and even now hearing people say aspiring to bodhicitta, like aspiration, and we're also talking about aspiring bodhicitta. I think it's very easy for this discussion to be confusing to
because of different terms?
Well, those are two separate things. Aspiring bodhicitta doesn't mean aspiring to bodhicitta.
Why? What is your understanding of the difference?
Aspiring bodhicitta is what we usually are referring to when we say bodhicitta. Someone who's got aspiring bodhicitta has bodhicitta. What they're aspiring to is not bodhicitta, they're aspiring to Buddhahood. And then the distinction between that and engaging bodhicitta is that, the bodhisattva with engaging bodhicitta is actually undertaking the things that will get them to Buddhahood.
When I hear aspiring to bodhicitta and aspiring bodhicitta, I hear the same thing. And when Rinpoche says bodhicitta motivation, she's talking about aspiring bodhicitta. That has confused students for years until she finally says, oh, I know what your problem is. You think when I say aspiring bodhicitta motivation, I mean bodhicitta. It's not the same thing. Bodhicitta motivation is the motivation to attain bodhicitta. And so if when we talk about bodhicitta, that's what we're usually talking about, that's our error in mixing up bodhicitta with bodhicitta motivation. Yes?
If we think about this as an introduction, this is maybe getting into too much detail, but it also will clarify, I think. I think if you look in old texts and different traditions and lineages, they use aspiring differently. So I think in the more traditional teachings that I've seen, they've been defining aspiring bodhicitta more like what you're saying, Taikshin, and certainly some of what Rinpoche said seems to be in alignment with that too. But if you look very old, I think there are some indicators that are consistent with what Colin is saying. So I think we're seeing an evolution in the use of this term and in the way we're looking at the process. So this is what we're really basically talking about if we take the terminology away as process, a process.
A process,
And
yes.
that word, aspiring, seems to be, over time, possibly moving to indicate different places in the process. And again, that went back to my question and curiosity also about it, is where are we in this, what are we talking
Where are
about
we
in this
in
process? But if we think about it in a process, then all of these steps, regardless of words that we use to label them, are still true.
Are still in the process. So. I think of authentic bodhicitta sort of like the North Star in a way. The North Star has been used for generations, untold generations on this planet, in order to let you know what direction you need to go. And at night, if you got off the wrong direction, you could look and find the North Star. Sometimes I go outside and I look for the North Star and I can find it. It's just sort of fun. That's north. When you're aspiring to bodhicitta, you value bodhicitta, and you find yourself getting off, just reorient. Just say, oh, wait a minute. I've stopped looking at bodhicitta. Now I'm looking at myself, or now I'm looking at what I want, or now I'm looking at what I want to get out of somebody else, or now I'm looking at how irritated I am with someone, or how disappointed I am with someone, or how afraid I am, or how nervous I am, or how tired I am, or how whatever. Whoops. I stopped looking at the North Star. And so the more you're in love with bodhicitta, or at least even want to fall in love with bodhicitta, you remind yourself, wait a minute. Let's reorient. Let's look at bodhicitta again. And you can find whatever way works for you, but I'm really going to recommend Chapter 1 of Shantideva. A good read through Chapter 1 is a great way to reorient to the North Star. So we go on. Thank you. If even the thought to relieve the headache of others is a beneficial intention that results in infinite merit, what can be said of the wish to dispel the immeasurable misery of each and every living being and lead them all to countless good qualities? So, rather than think that's impossible, sit there and imagine, what would it be like if the suffering of every living being were eliminated? Just imagine what it's like if the suffering of every living being were eliminated.
And what? Should say.
Imagine also.
That's words.
What would that feel like? Yes.
Rinpoche asked this question not too long ago online in a different way. How would if everyone was enlightened, how would you spend your time? And that's the same thing as saying if there's no suffering, everyone would be enlightened. And to me, it would be just a state of pure bliss and joy where everyone is always, their thoughts, their speech, and their action is always directed towards benefiting others. So it would just be endless acts of kindness.
Continuously.
Continuously.
And I noticed that you have a smile on your face. Did you notice that about a minute into this, the energy in the room changed? Did anyone feel the energy in the room shift about a minute into people starting to think about what would it be like? Why do you think the energy in the room changed?
Nobody's looking at themselves anymore.
Because you started actually imagining what it would feel like. And were you able to imagine something? And what did that feel like? What did that feel like? Well, I can see it on some of your faces. Yes.
So it feels like that state of being in love that you keep talking about. And am I hearing correctly that, or interpreting this correctly, that that state is about forgetting the self, like Toshinori just said?
Mm-hmm.
You're really forgetting yourself and focusing on others.
On others. And how did that feel?
Expansive.
Expansive?
Joyful.
Joyful? And you know what's interesting? How do most people in the world respond to the idea, forget yourself and think about others? What do they respond with?
You have to care for yourself.
You have to care for yourself first. If I do that, people are going to take advantage of me. They respond with fear and resistance. And guess what? We just experienced it. Is it fearful? Is it unpleasant? Do you feel taken advantage of? It's like wonderful. You're happy. You're happy. Oh my gosh. What was it Shanti Deva said? Those who wish to destroy their own suffering, those who wish to dispel the sufferings of others, and those who wish to experience much happiness should never forsake the practice of bodhicitta. He knew what he was talking about. Oh my gosh. I just think it's better than chocolate.
If before every thought, speech, or action, you just ask yourself, how would this benefit others? That question would stop you from committing any harm.
Oh, that's beautiful. In case it didn't get picked up on the video or the conference call, Tashi Norbu just said, if before every thought, speech, or action, you stopped and asked yourself, how will this benefit others? That thought would stop any harm. I don't know if there's an exact quote or a paraphrase.
Good enough.
He says it's good enough. I think you should get on Facebook and put that on there. I think you should post that. You had something to say.
I'm trying to understand. You mentioned the word ordinary compassion a couple of times, and I just want to make sure I understand it versus the bodhicitta. What I'm getting from that is that the bodhicitta is a compassionate mind wishing for enlightenment versus ordinary compassion is
the
not
people,
that last.
They're not, it's not, bodhicitta is a sweeter, it's more enriched, and it's tied to enlightenment. You realizing, wishing enlightenment, May I become enlightened so that I become capable of relieving living beings of suffering. I want to become enlightened so that I'll have the skill and the ability so I can become the one who's capable of doing it. And he actually goes on to talk about this a little bit later. People are compassionate, often want to relieve the suffering of others, but it doesn't occur to them, number one, that it's possible to become enlightened. And number two, that it's possible to completely relieve the suffering of others. So compassion is a very, very good thing. But they haven't realized its potential. So it's ordinary because they haven't tied it to an extraordinary aspiration. And that's kind of what he talks about next. He said, does our father or mother have such a beneficial intention as this? In other words, our father and our mother probably acted because they wanted us to be happy and didn't want us to suffer. But unless we had extraordinary parents, it's unlikely they were able to tie that to wishing all living beings to be happy and all living beings not to suffer. They probably only wished it for us and anyone they held dear and didn't realize that it could go further. He said, do the gods or the sages, and he's talking about the ordinary gods, not what the Judeo-Christian people mean by God, but the ordinary gods. Think of like the Roman and Greek gods, that type of a power being. Does even Brahma himself, remember this was being taught in India, if before generating living beings, these living beings do not even dream of such a mind for their own sakes. In other words, they don't even think it's possible. How will they develop it for the sake of others? So thank you for bringing that up. I didn't ask her to do this at this point, but it's a wonderful segue into what Shanti Deva says next. Does that make sense? Yes. Okay. That doesn't mean ordinary compassion is not meritorious and good and beneficial. It means the people haven't yet realized there's more. There's more that can be done with it. How can we possibly, let's see. This mind to benefit living beings, which does not arise in others even for their own sakes, is an extraordinary jewel of a mind, whose birth is an unprecedented wonder. It's an extraordinary jewel of a mind, whose birth is an unprecedented wonder. The moment you arise bodhicitta, the Buddhas, the Bodhisattvas, and especially your own guru, are going to be doing their own little version of a guru dance or a guru party. Because it's an unprecedented wonder. You think about how happy families are when a baby's born. Imagine how happy the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas are when a new Bodhisattva is born. How can we possibly measure the benefits of this jewel of a mind, the source of joy for all living beings and the cure for all their sufferings? So actually, when you want to relieve the suffering of all living beings, you want to become skillful at enticing them to fall in love with bodhicitta. Because what's it going to do? You already know what it's going to do. You've experienced a little bit of it today. It's going to cure their suffering and make them happy. This is the key. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, I was sort of, yes, that
Okay.
makes sense. Can I ask another question? Clarification? You asked us what we imagined it might be like to live in a world where all beings were without suffering, and therefore, presumably, were perfectly enlightened, yeah? Or at least were without suffering, and how we would react with a bodhicitta mind in that situation. Yes.
Actually, I asked you to imagine what it would like if all living beings were free from suffering. That's not limited to this world.
Right.
That's not limited to a world. That doesn't mean I'm living in a world where there's no suffering. That means there's no suffering in any world.
And as we answered, it was about happiness and not feeling this way or that way about others and all like that. But and that's sounds good. My impression is that the bodhicitta mind not only includes compassion but also includes wisdom, right? It's based on right understanding.
In our tradition of Buddhism, they consider wisdom and compassion to be like two wings of a bird.
But if one is, yes, but if one is perfectly, this is not, I don't have an answer here, this is really something I was confused by. If one is perfectly, if one has perfect understanding, if one has right understanding, then, as you pointed out earlier, the distinction, the existence of self vanishes. And so that distinction that we used in all of our answers about ourselves and others won't be there. In other words,
I realize that there are Buddhist masters who have taught that if you gain perfect wisdom, you will automatically gain compassion. And there are Buddhist traditions that currently teach that. Personally, I beg to disagree. If that were true, there would be no arhats. And there never would have been arhats. Because the minute those individuals became arhats and achieved that level of wisdom, they would automatically have become bodhisattvas. But in fact, there are arhats, and there were arhats, which basically is like the theory, the practice has, the data has to support the theory. If the data disagrees with the theory is an error. And the data shows that there have been arhats who did not become bodhisattvas, which disproves the entire theory that achieving perfect wisdom automatically will give you perfect compassion. Now, I thought this, and I said, Rinpoche, I know so-and-so taught this, but I disagree for this reason, and she agreed with me. So you can disagree with she and I, but I thought it through, and I said, no, it's possible to have wisdom without compassion. Sadly, it is possible. I think that the people who taught that might have been teaching from their own experience. When they had attained wisdom, their compassion arose. But I'm going to suspect it's because they had already worked on compassion in their previous lifetimes. And by achieving wisdom, the obstacles to their compassion growing were removed. So for their experience, I think that is true because they'd already been working on compassion a long time. But I don't think it can be said of every being. Does that make sense? And this is my opinion. I acknowledge that there are Buddhist masters who will disagree with me.
My question was actually the inverse. Is it, if one has perfect compassion, does one automatically have perfect wisdom?
Not perfect, but one will have a level of wisdom.
And wisdom is the recognition of the non-existence of self.
That's a level of wisdom. There's two different broad categories of things to realize the non-existence of. One is the non-existence of phenomena, and the other is the non-existence of self. Both come under the umbrella of wisdom. So you're trying to make wisdom one thing when wisdom is a spectrum, just like compassion and bodhicitta are a spectrum.
I'm not going any particular place here, except that early on you said that the Dhamma we all agreed that the Dhamma could not disappoint.
Right.
And what I'm thinking is that we really, in our imperfect understanding of the world and the Dhamma, we don't really know where this train is going.
I think that was a point that Pema brought up too.
And that,
is our imperfect understanding can cause us to become disappointed.
And we can begin to feel like things aren't going properly because it isn't what we imagined. In other words, if our concept of perfect, very strongly developed compassion still is couched in terms of us and them, when in fact perfect compassion probably makes no distinction between self and
others.
We can get into a situation where it's not going.
What you're alluding to is what in the teachings are often referred to as relative compassion and ultimate compassion, or relative bodhicitta and ultimate bodhicitta. You can't really skip over the relative to the ultimate. In terms of the process, you have to go through the relative to get to the ultimate.
I withdraw my question.
Does that make sense?
I'm just, you look looked at me and I was off drifting through this issue, so fine.
You were wandering into ideas about self and no self, but I think for a very, very long period of time, and then beyond that, a sense, I'm curious if you're talking about also a sense of identity and a sense of being an individual. Because from that perspective, I think my understanding of the Dharma is that for a very, very long time, that can cause a problem, but it also is useful. We see bodhisattvas come and they have their own identity and their own distinction from others, and it's useful for their agenda. So I was curious if you were talking about sort of this ultimate concept of bodhicitta or just this sense of identity.
I'm a Theravada Buddhist.
Okay, and Theravada. Okay, that makes sense because bodhicitta is not something that's
I understand.
strongly in Theravada.
It's a different, completely different tradition. But I'm not saying therefore anything.
Right.
So I'm just said that because I'm going to answer from the Theravada tradition, which is that the last fetter which falls away that binds us to a continued existence is asmimana, which translates from the Pali basically as measuring oneself against others. In other words, seeing a distinction between oneself and others, so that the whole thing vanishes. One does not see oneself as separate from the world. And if that were true in perfect compassion, then all of the way we're thinking about this is not the way it's going to be. In other words, we're thinking about being compassionate toward things and but it's very likely that that whole way of seeing the world is what's gone. That's what I was working with.
Our teachers taught us, and the others in the Mahayana tradition, that what you're talking about in an ultimate sense is true, but we're living in a relative existence. And in order to get through the relative existence to the ultimate, we have to accomplish the relative goals. So it's sort of like you have to put the ingredients of the recipe together and actually bake it before you get the result. And part of the putting the ingredients together and baking it is working with a separation of self and other in identity, but not in value, and putting others before you in terms of your thoughts and your efforts. And that moves you toward the ability. So the equanimity, the parity, the compassion, the not looking at yourself moves you toward the ability to eventually enter perfection, where in fact there is no distinction between self and others. There are no differences. At that level, yes, we are all one, but until we reach that level, we're not.
And the bodhicitta mind does not include that final recognition, correct? Is that what I'm understanding there?
The ultimate bodhicitta does. Ultimate bodhicitta does. Relative bodhicitta is moving in that direction. It's the process. Does that make sense?
I guess. I mean, so.
This is an interesting conversation between Mahayana and Theravada Buddhism. This is an interesting conversation between Mahayana and Theravada.
It's all the same fundamental message, it's just packaged differently, I think. And so that's what's my source of my question, that I was trying to understand better. If the bodhisattva the bodhisattva chooses not to reach final realization, right, enlightenment, until all others can join with them. Am I right in that?
That's actually, no, not according to our tradition.
Okay. Well,
there may be Mahayana traditions where that is the way it's seen. In our tradition, it is not. We're running out of time, I'm sorry. Afterwards, let's stay and talk. We'll chat. Almost done. There's only a few verses left. We're on the last page, and I want to read it just because I intended to. If the mere intention to benefit others is more meritorious than making offerings to the Buddhas, what can be said of actually striving for the happiness of every single living being? So we're talking again about the creation of merit. He's explaining why it's so meritorious. This is a key passage, and we've experienced it earlier in this discussion when we were thinking, what's it like? What would it be like if all living beings were free of suffering? He says, although living beings wish to be free from suffering, they run straight toward the causes of suffering. And although they wish for happiness, out of ignorance they destroy it like a foe. The causes of suffering is self-cherishing, or putting self before others. And people put self before others because they're afraid that if they don't, they're going to be taken advantage of and they're going to suffer. And what we experienced when we even imagined what it was like is actually that's not true. We're happy. All right, so it's like we've got this error. We've got something totally reversed. And this is what he's saying. Some of you may have heard me tell this before. When I had a group of students, I was teaching their nursing class, and I also had a smaller group in the lab, and we take them into the lab and we let them practice on nursing skills so that they have to show a certain degree of competence before we turn them loose with an actual living human being, you know? So I had this group of students who were really complain. And this was very common for them. So I was trying to teach them that this wasn't a good idea. And I wanted to give them an example. So I took one of the students, and as a job that she did part-time to earn money, she worked as a tech for a labor and delivery unit, which is where they deliver moms and babies. And so I said, okay, let's imagine that you've taken care of this mom and this baby, and now you're discharging them home. You've got the mom, you've got her in a wheelchair, you're wheeling her out to the car. The dad picks up the car to the front of the hospital. He gets out, they look at the mom, they look at the baby, they're so happy, they look at each other, they're so happy, they get in the car, and you're looking at them, and they're so happy with, and sure, her face just lit up, thinking about this mom and this dad and how happy they were with the baby. So they drive away and they don't even say, thank you. And she goes, like, wait a minute, what happened? 30 seconds ago you were grinning from ear to ear. What happened? Why are you suddenly not happy? Now mind you, want to talk about illusory, I made the whole thing up. I was telling a story. I was creating a scenario. What happened when she was happy, and what happened when she became unhappy?
Self-reverence. Or self-reference even, just looking at yourself.
Yes. When she was in her mind looking at the mom and the dad and the baby and their happiness, she was happy. The minute she turned around and looked at herself and said, what about me? She was unhappy. And that's what Shantideva is saying. People are confused. They got that reversed. They don't do it intentionally. Nobody does that intentionally. No one's going to create sorrow intentionally. That would be nuts. But they're confused. For those who are deprived of happiness and afflicted with many sorrows, bodhicitta bestows upon them boundless joy and eradicates all their suffering. And even dispels their confusion. This is interesting, it dispels their confusion. We just talked about running confused. Where is virtue equal to this? Where is there even such a friend? Where is there merit such as this? Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and encourage you to read the rest. I'm just going to skip to the last verse. I prostrate to those who have generated this holy, precious mind of bodhicitta and go for refuge to those sources of happiness who bestow bliss even upon those who harm them. I hope I have persuaded you to fall in love with